The afternoon of October 10th, 1928, was an ordinary one on Avenue A in Manhattan. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Men in fedoras walked past pushcarts and tenements, their faces set in the familiar patterns of daily life. But on that street, history was about to turn on the pull of a trigger. Salvatore D'Aquila, the powerful and feared boss of bosses, was walking near his home. He was the undisputed king of the Sicilian underworld in New York, a man whose word was law. He had ruled for nearly 2 decades, a patriarch from the old country who commanded respect and terror in equal measure. His authority was absolute, his reach seemingly endless. Suddenly, the ordinary afternoon was shattered by the sharp crack of gunfire. 2 cars, dark and menacing, had screeched to a halt. Men spilled out, their faces grim, their hands holding pistols. D'Aquila, caught completely by surprise, had no time to react. The bullets tore through his tailored suit, a brutal and public execution. He fell to the pavement, his reign ending in a pool of his own blood on a city sidewalk. The assassins vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a scene of chaos and a message that could not be misunderstood. The old ways were over. The king was dead. The news of D'Aquila's murder spread through the tightly knit Italian neighborhoods like a shockwave. It was more than just the death of a man, it was the collapse of an empire. For years, D'Aquila had maintained a fragile peace through sheer force of will. He was the final arbiter of disputes, the ultimate authority in a world that operated by its own ruthless code. His death created a void, a sudden and terrifying emptiness at the very top of the criminal hierarchy. Capos and soldiers whispered in cafes and social clubs, their minds racing. Who had dared to strike down the boss of bosses? And more importantly, who would be bold enough to take his place? The killing was a declaration of war. It signaled a shift in power, a violent changing of the guard. The old world traditions of honor and respect, which D'Aquila had tried to uphold, seemed to die with him on that sidewalk. A new generation of gangsters, younger and more ambitious, saw their chance. They were men who had been forged not in the hills of Sicily, but in the brutal streets of New York. They were hungry for power and wealth, and they were willing to do anything to get it. The death of Salvatore D'Aquila was not an end. It was a beginning, a bloody, violent beginning. Into this chaotic world stepped a man named Giuseppe Masseria. He was known on the street as Joe the Boss. He was short, stout, and had a face that looked like it had been carved from rough stone. Masseria was born in Marsala, Sicily, in 1886, and he carried the grit of his homeland with him to America. He arrived in New York in 1903, a young man with nothing to his name but a fierce ambition. He did not have the aristocratic bearing of a man like D'Aquila. Instead, he was a creature of the slums, a brawler who understood the language of the fist and the knife long before he mastered the art of criminal politics. Masseria's early years in America were a masterclass in survival. He quickly fell in with the Morello crime family, the first great mafia dynasty in New York. He learned the rackets from the ground up, extortion, loan sharking, and the brutal enforcement that kept the system running. He was arrested for burglary and served time in prison, an experience that only hardened his resolve. He was not a man of grand speeches or intricate philosophies. His belief was simple: power belonged to the man strong enough to take it. He saw the world as a battlefield, and he intended to be its victorious general. Unlike the traditional mustache Petes who clung to the old Sicilian ways, Masseria was a pragmatist. He understood that New York was not Sicily. The key to power was not just heritage, but money and muscle. He saw the potential of prohibition, the new law that had made criminals into kings. Bootlegging offered unimaginable profits, and Masseria wanted his share. He was willing to work with anyone, not just Sicilians if it served his purpose. This was a radical idea at the time, an insult to the old guard who prized ethnic purity above all else. But Masseria cared little for their traditions. He cared only for what worked. By the time D'Aquila was killed, Joe Maseria was already a formidable force in his own right. He had built a powerful crew in Lower Manhattan, a loyal band of killers and earners who looked to him as their leader. He was known for his ruthlessness, but also for a certain crude charm. He was a man who enjoyed the simple pleasures of life: a good meal, a fine cigar, the feel of cash in his pocket. He was underestimated by his rivals, who saw him as little more than a brutish thug. It was a mistake they would come to regret. Joe the Boss was a thug, but he was a cunning one, and he was ready to make his move. The death of Salvatore D'Aquila did not just remove a leader, it shattered the very structure of the New York Mafia. D'Aquila had been the connecting tissue, the central figure holding together a loose confederation of powerful and often warring gangs. He settled disputes over territory, mediated conflicts, and approved or vetoed major criminal enterprises. His authority, backed by a reputation for swift and lethal retribution, was the glue of the underworld. With him gone, that glue dissolved overnight. The organization he had built, known as the Unione Siciliana, began to fracture. Suddenly, every ambitious capo and gang leader saw an opportunity. The throne was empty, and there was no clear line of succession. D'Aquila's own gang in East Harlem and the Bronx was thrown into disarray, its lieutenants scrambling to secure their own positions. Other powerful bosses across the city, men who had paid tribute to D'Aquila, now saw no reason to respect his old boundaries. It was a free-for-all. The unspoken rules that had governed the criminal landscape for a decade were now worthless. It was a time of immense danger, but also of immense possibility for those who were bold enough to seize it. The power vacuum was most intensely felt in the streets. Small-time disputes that would have once been settled by D'Aquila now escalated into open warfare. Bootlegging crews began hijacking each other's trucks with impunity. Loan sharks and bookies fought over lucrative street corners. The fragile peace that had allowed organized crime to flourish was replaced by a state of near-constant, low-level conflict. The police were largely unable and often unwilling to intervene in these internal gangland struggles. For the men of the underworld, there was only one law that mattered, the law of the strongest. This was the environment that Joe Maseria had been waiting for. He saw the chaos not as a problem, but as a ladder. While other gangsters were focused on protecting their small territories or settling old scores, Masseria had a larger vision. He aimed to rebuild the entire structure, but with himself at the top. He understood that the first person to bring order to the chaos would become the new king. He knew it would require violence, cunning, and a willingness to break every rule. The city was a prize waiting to be claimed, and Joe Maseria was ready to pay the price in blood. Joe Maseria's rise to power was not simply a story of brute force. It was a clinic in manipulation, a dark ballet of shifting alliances and shocking betrayals. He understood that in the world of the mafia, a friend today could be an enemy tomorrow, and the only loyalty that truly mattered was loyalty to oneself. Masseria mastered the art of the double cross. He would form partnerships with rivals, using their strength and resources to eliminate a common foe, only to turn on his allies once they had served their purpose. He promised power and wealth to those who would join him, and he delivered just enough to keep them on his side, but never enough to make them a threat. One of his earliest and most important maneuvers was his relationship with Giuseppe Peter Morello, the original boss of bosses, who had been sidelined by D'Aquila. Morello was old and his power had faded, but his name still carried weight. Masseria shrewdly allied himself with the remnants of the Morello clan, positioning himself as their protector and champion. He used Morello's experience and connections to gain legitimacy among the older generation of mafiosi. In return, he gave Morello a position of respect within his growing organization. It was a brilliant move, lending him an air of tradition while he systematically dismantled it. Betrayal was Masseria's sharpest weapon. He was a master at turning a rival's own men against him. He would identify a disgruntled lieutenant in an enemy camp and make him an offer he couldn't refuse. Help overthrow your boss, and you will take his place under my authority. This tactic sowed paranoia and distrust throughout the New York underworld. Bosses began to look at their most trusted soldiers with suspicion. No one knew who might be secretly on Masseria's payroll. One of the most significant examples was his campaign against Umberto Valenti, a fearsome gunman who stood in his way. Masseria methodically eliminated Valenti's allies, isolating him until he was vulnerable. The most famous story of his cunning came during a war with Valenti. Legend has it that Masseria, cornered in a restaurant, feigned surrender. He offered to meet Valenti to negotiate peace. When Valenti arrived for the meeting, he walked directly into an ambush set by Masseria's gunmen. Valenti was shot down in the street, his death sending a clear message to all of Masseria's rivals. Joe the Boss was not a man to be trifled with. He did not play by the established rules of honor. He wrote his own rules, and they were written in the blood of those who dared to oppose him. The Morello crime family was the foundation of the mafia in America. They were the first. Arriving from Corleone, Sicily, The Morello brothers and their half-brother, Ignazio the Wolf Lupo, established a criminal enterprise in East Harlem that became the template for all that followed. They were pioneers in extortion, counterfeiting, and murder. But by the 1920s, the family was a shadow of its former self. Years of infighting, police pressure, and long prison sentences had decimated their leadership. Giuseppe Peter Morello, the one-time boss of bosses, was out of prison, but his influence had waned. The gang was a ship without a captain. Joe Maseria, who had gotten his start as a soldier for the Morellos, saw this as a golden opportunity. He had remained loyal to Peter Morello, at least on the surface. While others had abandoned the old boss, Masseria positioned himself as the family's rightful heir. He presented himself not as a usurper, but as a restorer of the Morellos' former glory. He gathered the remaining members of the gang, men who were adrift and looking for a strong leader. He promised them a return to the good old days, a chance to be powerful and respected once more. Masseria's takeover of the Morello gang was less of a violent conquest and more of a strategic absorption. He effectively adopted the family's legacy. By making Peter Morello his top advisor, a consigliere of sorts, Masseria gained the invaluable wisdom and respect that came with the Morello name. He inherited their networks, their rackets, and their remaining soldiers. This move instantly elevated his status from that of a powerful street boss to a major player with a legitimate claim to a historic criminal dynasty. It was a crucial step in his consolidation of power in Manhattan. With the formidable Morello machine now under his control, Masseria's ambitions grew. He was no longer just the boss of a Little Italy crew. He was the head of a sprawling organization with roots stretching back to the dawn of the Mafia in New York. This inheritance gave him the manpower and the infrastructure to expand his operations. He aggressively moved into the lucrative world of bootlegging, using the Morello network to distribute alcohol throughout the city. The gang was reborn under his leadership, more powerful and profitable than it had been in years. The Morello inheritance had become the engine of the Masseria empire. As Joe Maseria's power grew, it inevitably brought him into conflict with another powerful faction of the Sicilian Mafia, the immigrants from the coastal town of Castellammare del Golfo. This was not a new rivalry. Back in Sicily, the clans from Castellammare and Masseria's region had a long history of suspicion and conflict. In New York, these old-world tensions found fertile ground. The Castellammarese were a proud and insular group. They saw Masseria as an uncultured, power-hungry brute who did not respect their traditions. They operated their own powerful gangs, particularly in Brooklyn, and refused to bow to his authority. The leader of the Castellammarese faction in the United States was Salvatore Maranzano. He was everything Masseria was not. Maranzano was educated, well-read, and a student of Roman history. He saw himself as a modern-day Julius Caesar, destined to organize the chaotic American mafia into a structured empire modeled on the Roman legions. He was charismatic and sophisticated, but beneath the polished exterior was a will of iron and a capacity for extreme violence. He arrived in New York in the mid-1920s and quickly consolidated control over the Castellammarese clans, creating a formidable force to challenge Masseria's dominance. The conflict between Masseria and Maranzano was inevitable. It was a clash of personalities, styles, and ambitions. Masseria demanded that all the mafia families in New York pay him tribute. He wanted to be the undisputed boss of bosses, the sole ruler of the underworld. Maranzano and his Castellammarese allies saw this as an insult. They refused to subordinate themselves to a man they considered their inferior. The tension simmered for years, marked by sporadic violence and failed attempts at negotiation. Each side tested the other's strength, building their forces for the war they both knew was coming. The breaking point arrived in the late 1920s. Masseria, growing impatient and ever more arrogant, began to aggressively move against Castellammarese rackets. He demanded a larger share of their profits and ordered his men to intimidate their businesses. This was a direct challenge that Maranzano could not ignore. The lines were drawn. The New York underworld split into two armed camps, those loyal to Joe Maseria and those who sided with Salvatore Maranzano. The stage was set for a bloody conflict that would tear the mafia apart. It would be known as the Castellammarese War. The world of the early New York Mafia was a brutal and unforgiving place. Life was cheap, and death could come at any moment for any reason. A perceived insult, a dispute over a few dollars, or the simple misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time could get a man killed. The rise of Joe Maseria intensified this culture of violence. He ruled through fear, and the streets of Little Italy and other immigrant neighborhoods became the backdrop for his bloody ascent. Gunfights erupted in broad daylight, bodies were found in alleyways, and the sound of the Lupara, the Sicilian sawed-off shotgun, became a familiar terror. For the gangsters who lived in this world, danger was a constant companion. They existed in a state of heightened alert, always watching their backs. They couldn't trust anyone completely, not even their closest friends. A meal in a restaurant or a walk down the street could be their last. This constant threat of violence shaped their personalities, making them paranoid, suspicious, and quick to anger. Yet they also embraced a certain fatalism. They had chosen this life, and they accepted its risks. They displayed their wealth and power with flashy suits, expensive cars, and diamond rings, a defiant gesture in the face of their own mortality. The violence was not random. It was a tool of business and a form of communication. When a rival bootlegger was gunned down, it served as a warning to others to stay off that territory. When an uncooperative shopkeeper's store was firebombed, it sent a message to the entire neighborhood about the importance of paying protection money. Masseria was a master of this kind of strategic terror. Every act of violence he ordered was calculated to enhance his power and reputation. He wanted everyone, from the lowest street punk to the most powerful boss, to know that crossing Joe the Boss meant a death sentence. The ordinary people of these neighborhoods were caught in the crossfire. They were the silent witnesses to the carnage, forced to live under the thumb of men like Masseria. They paid tribute to the mob, kept their mouths shut when the police asked questions, and prayed that the violence would not touch their own families. The code of silence, or omerta, was not just a criminal tradition, it was a survival mechanism for an entire community. They lived in a world apart, governed by a shadow state where Joe Maseria was the law and his gunmen were the executioners. By the end of the 1920s, Joe Maseria had achieved what once seemed impossible. Through a relentless campaign of violence, intimidation, and betrayal, he had climbed to the top of the New York underworld. He had eliminated or absorbed his most significant rivals. The old D'Aquila gang was his. The powerful Morello family now answered to him. Numerous smaller gangs across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx paid him tribute. He had successfully transformed the chaotic free-for-all that followed D'Aquila's death into a new, centralized empire with himself as the absolute monarch. Masseria's power was vast. He controlled the most profitable rackets of the Prohibition era, including bootlegging, gambling, and loan sharking. His organization was a formidable machine with hundreds of loyal soldiers ready to carry out his orders. He held court in the restaurants and social clubs of Little Italy, a modern-day emperor receiving his subjects. Capos from across the city came to him to seek his approval, to settle disputes, and to offer him a share of their earnings. His word was final. To defy him was to risk not only your own life, but the lives of your entire crew. He had become the new boss of bosses, a title he had coveted for so long. But his style of rule was different from D'Aquila's. Where D'Aquila had ruled with a certain old-world dignity, Masseria ruled with a heavy, brutish fist. He was greedy, demanding ever larger shares of his underlings' profits. He was impulsive and quick to anger, often ordering hits based on rumor or slight. His arrogance grew with his power. He saw himself as invincible, the undisputed king of New York. He failed to see that his oppressive style of leadership was creating resentment and fear among his own men. This firm grip on power, however, contained the seeds of its own destruction. While he had consolidated control over much of New York, he had not eliminated the Castellammarese threat led by Salvatore Maranzano. In fact, his aggressive tactics only served to unite his enemies. Many gangsters who had once been neutral or even allied with Masseria began to secretly shift their allegiance to Maranzano, who promised them a more reasonable and structured form of leadership. Masseria, sitting on his throne, was blind to the growing conspiracy against him. His reign was absolute, but it was built on a foundation of terror, and terror is a notoriously unstable foundation. The rise of Joe Maseria represents a pivotal moment in the history of American organized crime. He was a transitional figure, a bridge between the old-world Sicilian gangs and the modern, multi-ethnic crime syndicates that would follow. His story is a stark lesson in the nature of power. He demonstrated that in the brutal meritocracy of the underworld, ambition and ruthlessness could overcome tradition and pedigree. He did not inherit his empire. He built it with his own two hands, cementing its foundations with the blood and bodies of his enemies. His legacy is not one of statesmanship, but of sheer, unadulterated force. Masseria's methods, particularly his willingness to use betrayal as a primary weapon and his openness to working with non-Sicilians, forever changed the game. He tore up the old rulebook and wrote a new one, where the only principle was victory. He showed future generations of gangsters, men like Lucky Luciano who served under him, that the old ways were a weakness. Luciano in particular watched and learned from Masseria's successes and, more importantly, from his failures. He saw how Masseria's greed and tyrannical style ultimately turned his own allies against him, a lesson he would later apply with deadly precision. Ultimately, the empire Masseria built was as fragile as the fear it was built upon. His reign, which seemed so absolute, would come to a violent end in a Brooklyn restaurant in 1931, betrayed by the very men he had elevated. His death would usher in yet another new era, leading to the formation of the Commission, the corporate board of the Mafia designed specifically to prevent another bloody war like the one he had started. In a way, the modern structure of the American Mafia was created in direct response to his chaotic and destructive reign. The story of Joe the Boss is a quintessential American tragedy, twisted through the dark lens of the underworld. It is the story of an immigrant who came to a new world seeking power and found it in its most brutal form. He rose from nothing to become a king, only to be consumed by the same violence he had used to achieve his throne. His name is now etched in the bloody history of New York City, a permanent reminder that empires built on fear are destined to fall, and that the man who lives by the gun will almost certainly die by it.